Welcome, everybody, back to another player interview series on the USFL podcast. James Larsen here, joined by legendary Michigan Panthers kicker Cole Murphy. How you doing today, Cole?
Good, man. How are you?
Doing great, doing great. Thanks for coming on the show. It's been pretty busy off season for you. You've had a lot going on when it comes to training, and also I know you've been doing some stuff with 3-point kicking. Kind of training some other kickers. What's that process been like for you since the season ended?
Yeah, it's been pretty good. So for the most part, we get back and we're in the fall. So I'm working on the high school season. Do you know Sierra Canyon High School? It's a private school out here in LA. I'm their kicking coach, so I work with those guys. And then I do private lessons kind of outside of that. So it's been we've been working with kids, trying to get them into college, prepping them for college if they're seniors, all that kind of stuff. But it's been good. It's been really, really good.
Great to hear. And I'm assuming, on top of that, you're also training as well, preparing for a season that's probably going to be coming sooner than later. At some point in March 30th is what it looks like the starting date will be. So what's that like for you right now? Just making sure you're staying ready for the upcoming season.
Yeah, it's going pretty good. So I'm living in North LA right now. I drive about 2 hours down south about 3 days a week. Go work with John Carney, who played in the NFL for about 23 seasons, and there's a lot of USFL and XFL guys down there. So just good training environment. We get to kick on the field, go lift in the gym, watch film. We'll bring in some guys every once in a while. So it's pretty cool to work with those guys. And yeah, I mean, overall, I feel pretty good. Training's been really good, and I'm prepared for season. Now I'm in the transition period where I'm going from NFL balls to like USFL balls, XFL balls, all that kind of stuff because it takes a little bit of adjusting. So
Oh, for sure. I mean, and of course, you got to make sure you're preparing with both because, I mean, we don't really know which ball you're going to be using this upcoming season. The leagues announced that they're going to be merging. They will be playing a combined season. That came out last week. Right now, still not full clarity on the teams, but it seems like Michigan will be a part of it, which is great news. Kind of what's your thought process heading into this upcoming season where there's a lot of unknowns? I'm sure that mentally it's like, well, I got to make sure I'm ready for whatever might come my way. So what's that process like for you?
yeah, I mean, I've just been staying ready. I mean, I needed to sign a new contract anyway, so I had already been kind of trying to reach out to other teams in case, and I had said, look, I want to play in Michigan. I love Michigan, but if they don't want me, what are the chances? And so I kind of already had this mentality of like I don't really know where I stand, and this is all before the merger stuff anyway too. So
Right.
I more than anything, I was just making sure that no matter what scenario came up, I was ready. And luckily, I've been in this league a couple of years. I've been doing the spring football stuff for a handful of years, and so I kind of know what to expect from it. And yeah, I mean, luckily Daryl put me in touch with the guys over at Big Game USA, who they make all the footballs for the USFL and the XFL, and so I've actually been helping them with test footballs just to see like what works, what doesn't work. And to be honest, actually, I don't know which ones are even test balls for our league or for college balls or whatever. So
Right, right.
I've been just kind of helping them with everything. But actually, it's really kind of helped me kind of figure out, okay, I prefer footballs that are a certain way over another way, and just overall, I'm learning more about myself as a kicker and figuring out what works the best. But yeah, I mean, overall, it's a weird situation we're in with all this merger stuff going on, and it's just different. It's very, very different.
Yeah. Which I mean, it kind of has been the staple in spring football. There's always something different every single year. I mean, kind of going back to 2018, 19, the XFL announced they were coming back. The Alliance of American Football came out of nowhere. COVID hits. Those leagues aren't around anymore. The USFL pops up. And that's kind of where, you really solidified yourself in the spring football scene, joining Michigan last year. I'd love to hear a little bit more about like what that was like for you because you weren't on the team to start the season. They needed a kicker. They brought you in and then you joined the team and you instantly started kicking from 60 yards out. What was that like for you?
For sure. Well, I think it goes back a little bit further before all the USFL stuff started. I had been bouncing around a little bit. I was in the NFL for a little bit with Cardinals, and then COVID hit, and all of a sudden it was really hard to get onto a roster. So I spent like 2 years trying to find a new team and trying to figure out what I can do, how I can train, what's going to set me apart from everybody else.
Right.
So, going into that, I had been working with a sports psychologist trying to get my mental side better. I had been training really well and I felt really good. And then, Carney puts on this USFL combine every single year now. And I got to go to the first one. And luckily I knew some of the people from previous leagues. Like Daryl was a part of the AAF, and then he was with the XFL in 2020. So I had spent a good amount of time just around him, and he's a Syracuse alum just like me. So it was cool just to kind of spend some time with him. And then yeah, so overall did well at the combine. The one thing that I think got me in trouble was even though I punted at the combine, I didn't list myself as a kicker and a punter. And with the roster restrictions, they needed somebody to do both early on. So you saw a lot
Right.
of teams early on went with one guy. And so yeah, so on draft day, I actually was sitting there watching the whole thing. I watched every single round. And then the kicker round shows up. And rather than them going one pick at a time, there all of a sudden was like this 10-15 minute gap where no picks had come out. They hadn't talked about anything. And all of a sudden, bang, all of the teams had already picked their guys.
Right.
And, Matt Mengel was on there and all these other guys and good combo guys that realistically like should be playing ball. So, yeah, I mean, I was pretty distraught. I was like, man, I really thought I did well at this combine. In my opinion, solidified myself as one of the top kickers, but
Right.
I wasn't listed as a combo guy. So in a lot of teams' eyes, I wasn't really an option. Um, so yeah, so Michigan starts the season. Special teams wise, they did decent. They didn't do terribly. It's hard to do kicking and punting, and people also don't realize if you have one guy that does both, you have to have a guy that's holding that typically isn't a holder because usually the punter's the holder.
Right.
So with Mac, like his putting was phenomenal. His kicking, he struggled a little bit because he didn't have cohesion with a different holder. Um, so anyway, so yeah, so he struggled a little bit. I came in, and then luckily they opened up the roster spots. They had gotten rid of the chip ball, all that kind of stuff, all pieced together at the same time. So I obviously I was successful and I did well, but it's not just because of me. There was a lot of factors that went hand in hand with that kind of really helped me solidify it.
Right. And to your point, like when a guy has to do both kicking and punting, that's a lot of stress that they're going under each and every game where you can't just focus on one. And that's kind of what we saw when you came in. And then when some of these other teams ended up having kickers and punters, the special teams play all around just got a lot better because then each player could just focus on what they do best and what they were signed to do originally. And a guy like Mac, we saw him go to the XFL this year and punt, and he was very, very good because all he had to do was focus on punting. That was his one and only thing. So I feel like that's been an interesting part of the league. And for you, you came into the league midway through the 2022 season, and you played in the hub in Birmingham. That's when all the teams were in Birmingham. What was that like for you? Because I know this year, obviously, you played in Michigan. You were a home team, but 2022, kind of having that road atmosphere every game. What was that situation like?
Surprisingly, it's actually something I've been through before. Just because in the spring league we were in Indianapolis and everybody was all together. Or at least half of it was. The other half was down, I think in Birmingham. But yeah, I've been part of that before, where there's multiple teams all in one location, and it's kind of nice because you get to meet other players in different teams. All of a sudden, you'll see guys that were not teammates, like at that point now are teammates, and vice versa. And so it's cool to build a community. Like I know before we started, we talked about Matt Seibert. He was teammates with me in the spring league, and now he's with
Conquerors, right?
uh, yeah, we were with the Conquerors, and now he's with Maulers, if I'm not mistaken. And so yeah, so it's really an interesting dynamic because all of a sudden you're working with all these different people, and it's more of a communal thing. Like yes, we're playing each other, but we're trying to make this work. We're trying to just build this from scratch essentially. So it's
Right.
a pretty cool environment, even though you really technically are away. Realistically, 7 out of the 8 teams were away.
Exactly.
Birmingham had
Exactly.
home
Yeah.
game every single week, whether they were quote unquote home or away. They were home. So
Yeah. Right. I mean, it was obviously an interesting environment, without really any fans at all, except for the Stallions games, which then leads into the 2023 season, where all of a sudden we had four hubs, and Michigan was lucky enough they were able to secure Ford Field. Things went pretty well there. Some great fan turnouts. What was that experience like? Were you able to play for a home crowd again? And there were some ruckus crowds here in Michigan this year. It was a lot of fun, even during that home losing stretch there.
yeah, yeah, it was pretty cool. I mean, I going to a Power Five school, I'm used to playing in big crowds. I mean, we played at Clemson when they had 90,000. I played in Wake Forest when there's a hurricane and there's less than 1,000. So I've kind of played everything. And same thing in high school. I mean, you go from like 500 people to maybe a couple thousand, depending on the level of the game or the stakes or whatever it is. But it's pretty special when you go into a stadium like that and you really have genuine fans that are there for the love of the game. It's our first year in the city, in the state, really, actually. And yeah, I mean, it's really, really something special when you go in there and they want football to be there while you're there. It's really something special. Whereas, in college and high school, even in the NFL, like a great example for the Cardinals when I was there, Cardinals have been there forever, right? So it's like I showed up and there was already hundreds of thousands of Cardinals fans.
Right.
You show up in Michigan, you don't know if you're going to show up with 100 people or 20,000 or somewhere in the middle. You have no idea, but it's pretty cool to see, especially on that first day. We ran out there and there was a great crowd, and even on that last game when we played Philly, came down to the wire and people showed up, and I think it was Father's Day, if I'm not mistaken. And
Yeah.
I kind of thought,
Yep.
it's a holiday, no one's going to show up, and no, they really did. They showed out.
Yeah, it's a really neat atmosphere, especially when, like you said, you're introducing a brand new franchise to a city or a state, in this example, which of course Michigan existed back in the 80s, but like that's so far removed from the current iteration that it's basically a whole new fan base at this point. So yeah, and to circle back a little bit to the season itself, you had that rough middle patch during the year where you lost those 4 home games, frustration was mounting, and the team ends up turning things around. You get that clutch home win against Philly. What was that process like, with the team, with you yourself, just like trying to push through that adversity and end up making the playoffs?
Well, for us, I think what was so frustrating was we knew how good we were. I mean, on paper, we were a very good team, and I think realistically, if things had gone differently, obviously it's situational, but based on the level of talent we had, we could have gone 10-0. I mean, it's tough when you've got all these new things being thrown at you. You got a new staff coming in, you're in a new city, you've got growing pains, and it's going to happen no matter what. But at the end of the day, even with the hiccups, I'm not surprised we made playoffs. I'm surprised we didn't do even more.
Right.
And sometimes it's just going to happen. Sometimes you win games you should have lost, you lose games you should have won. It's just how it's going to go. Um, yeah, I think realistically for us, that was kind of our big thing. We didn't view ourselves as losing 4 games in a row. And actually, I didn't think about that until the very last game after it was done. I was like, wow, we actually didn't win a game in Detroit until the very end when it really mattered the most. Um, but yeah, I mean, it's frustrating very clearly. Um, but yeah, I mean, we on paper we knew how good we were, and that was the biggest thing for us.
Right. And then it's interesting you mentioned that because when you look at all the guys from the USFL that went to the NFL this year, the Panthers were the second team on that list. Of course, you had Birmingham, who had a ridiculous amount of players go, but Michigan had double digits as well. A lot of Panthers players got signed during this previous training camp. And it kind of goes to show like there was a ton of talent on this team. It just was a matter of trying to figure out that consistency, that cohesion, which you guys really put together in that last game. You had EJ Perry come in, his first start, leads the team to the playoffs. You had those fans singing what like nah 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 goodbye. That was a
Oh
super
yeah,
cool atmosphere. What was it like being a part of that?
it was pretty special. And I mean, EJ's a great dude. He's super smart. Yeah, obviously he's an Ivy guy. He knows how to pick up playbooks. And when you're in this industry and you have to go from team to team and you're not quite solidified yet, you have to be quick on your feet. You got to figure out how to make the offense work, how to piece everything together really fast. Because if you don't, you're going to get the boot, and maybe next time.
Right.
Um, but yeah, no, it was pretty great to see EJ come in there and perform, and it was cool to see how important it was to people in Detroit because when we had the momentum going, the fans were going crazy, we were going crazy, everything pieced together just at the right time, and it was really, really super special.
Right. Yeah, I mean everything came together at the end. Even with the 4-6 record, you ended up making the postseason. And then you face off against Pittsburgh, which I know ultimately you weren't able to get the win. But it was a back and forth game. One of the most exciting games of the year, in my opinion. There in that postseason, what was it like being able to compete for a championship in Canton at the Pro Football Hall of Fame and perform at a high level? I mean, you had that awesome kick there to send the game into overtime. Unfortunately, there's no kick in overtime, so that was the end of your game. But to knock that through, I know you're feeling confident before that kick. At least I feel like you were. What were the emotions like heading into that moment?
When with kicking itself, you can't ride the highs and the lows. You have to stay pretty neutral. I know some people always talk about the power of like positive thinking, but to be honest, I don't buy into it. I think it's not a load of crap, but I think you have to take the good. But realistically, if you just stay even keel the whole way through, you'll do pretty well. And you'll see too, like a lot of kickers, they don't get hyped up unless it's a game winner where they can really just let loose at the end, or if it's a game winner that really means something special. Like you'll see sometimes guys hit game winners and they just kind of stand there and everybody swarms them and then they walk away and it's no big
Yeah.
deal to them.
Yep.
Um, but yeah, I mean, you have to have the courage to go out there and you have to have the confidence to execute. I mean, when I walk out there, especially on that kick, I made sure I'm not running out there. I'm not slumbering out there. I'm even keel. I'm walking controlled. And if you watch the actual film of it, I stay relaxed the whole time. When they call the timeout, I'm walking away from everybody. I'm not talking to people. I'm staying focused and engaged. But it's very much I'm singularly focused on what I'm doing. And that's one of the keys to it. I mean, if you're all over the place, if you're excited when they score touchdowns and you're running down the field and celebrating with everybody, and then you freak out when they drop a pass, like you can't perform if you're doing this all the time. It doesn't work. So for me, that's kind of one of the big things that, especially working with my sports psychologist, we had to figure out because I used to be that guy. I'd get all excited when we'd score a touchdown. I'd be, part of the hoopla and everybody's like celebrating. Nowadays, I can't do that. I can't do that because I know it'll pull me out of my focus. But yeah, overall, I mean, that's just the key to performing, in my opinion, at least.
Right, right on. And I do want to point out one thing at the end of that kick. I know you were relaxed, you were focused going into it, but then you and your boy Kyle, you hit that pose at the end of it. Was that planned? Was that was that something you were planning to do throughout the season, or did it just happen?
Yeah, it's a nerd moment. To be honest, when you're in season and really all you're doing is football, you get caught into a bunch of different stuff. Like Kyle and I, we probably watched, it had to have been hundreds of episodes of anime. So if you're an anime fan, like you may figure out what it was. To be honest, like I probably not because he and I didn't do the pose very well. It looked more like we were digging for gold than the stance we were going for, but it kind of worked the same either way. Kyle and I afterwards, we took a picture of that. And we were like, "Hey man, like we got to work on these." That sucks.
All right, next season I'm expecting some great anime poses from you and Kyle. All right, we'll we'll,
Oh
we'll leave it
man,
at that.
oh boy, game winners. If they're game winners, I'll do it. If it's
Yeah,
in the
game
game,
winners.
I
Or I
can't.
mean, hey, if Kyle pins somebody inside the five, I mean, he there might be some merit to hit one, maybe.
Yeah, yeah, I
Depends on
might
the
go find him at
situation.
the half
Depends on the
line.
situation. If it's the ninth punt of the game, well, we'll see. We'll
Yeah,
see.
but hopefully it's the only punt he has to hit all game, and he just pins him
Yeah,
down.
exactly. So, anyways, moving forward here, obviously the 2024 season's coming up. We got these leagues coming together now. The USFL and XFL confirmed that they're playing a season starting March 30th. Again, no full clarity on the team situation. Seems like it's going to be between 8 and 10, but we don't have full confirmation. Regardless of all that, what's your mindset and kind of your opinion on the fact that with spring football, it's always been a scene where we've seen leagues come and go. So for two of these leagues to complete seasons in 2023, now we see them coming together to hopefully create a strong entity that can last for 5, 10, 15, 20 years down the road. What's your opinion on this whole situation?
I think it was inevitable at a certain point. I mean, whether it was a merger or whatever was going to happen, only one was going to last. And I don't mean that, as a competitive thing. It's just overall, if you have a certain pool of players, if it's diluted between two leagues, eventually one's not going to last. And it's tough. I mean, at the end of the day, it's difficult to see half the teams go away. But overall, at the end of the day, you're going to see better play overall because you're going to have the best players from all the teams jammed down into 8 or 10. Um, and at the end of the day, too, like these players, this is what we do for a living. We understand you're going to get cut. You're going to have your teams go away, especially in spring football. Like things
Yeah,
just they're not stable footing. So you got to make sure that you're able to improvise and adjust. You've got to make sure that you can just you got to do things on the fly. And sometimes that's just how it's going to go. And luckily for me, that's something that I feel like I do really well at. Whatever's a new situation, I tend to do pretty well at. So yeah, I mean, overall, I just at the end of the day, you've got to have plans, no matter what, and you got to understand, hey, if Michigan, for some reason, I can't imagine why, but if they're not a part of this, I've already had contingency plans. I got to make sure I'm going and doing my due diligence to make sure I still play, right?
right.
Granted, I'm under contract with Michigan. I love Michigan, and I'm not going anywhere if they'll have me. But, in terms of just my own personal career, you have to always make sure you're doing your homework. So I think all these players need to be doing that. And that's one thing that I saw online. A lot of players and a lot of fans would talk about, oh, all these guys are losing their jobs, and yes, like it's tough. But at the same time, the XFL only had 1 year contracts, if I'm not mistaken. So technically speaking, all these guys were going to be out of the job anyway unless they re-signed something. So
Right.
at the end of the day, if these guys didn't do their homework and didn't take advantage of that stuff, then it's kind of on them at a certain point. Now, granted, people that were under contract, like if you're in the USFL and you signed your first contract last year and your team gets cut, I completely understand. And same thing with the fans. Like if your team just gets ripped from you, like it's tough. It's tough, and I feel for them. I really do, because at the end of the day, they expected to be there.
Right. It's honestly like just the brutality side of business, right? Especially in the spring football scene where we've seen the AAF come and go, the XFL 2.0, they came and went. We've had some other leagues like the MLFB, which I mean that to me was more of a scam than anything. But even then, you had hundreds of players down there in Alabama practicing, and the next thing you know, they're stranded, they can't get into their hotels, and it's just a disaster. So it feels like we've seen a lot of these spring leagues come and go, and now hopefully with the backing of Fox, with the backing of Redbird on the XFL side, you actually have two leagues that can be like, all right, let's put aside our differences because they were competitive this year, but they've put that aside and it's like, all right, we see the future now, we see the goal. Let's make spring football last forever. So hopefully that's what we see. But aside from all the merger talk, just spring football in general, providing so many opportunities to guys like yourself, like everybody else on these 16 teams this year. Can you speak a bit on just like spring football being able to provide these platforms for you guys to continue your playing careers? Because I mean, without them, a lot of these guys would just be hanging it up.
Yeah, I mean it's really tough because there's such a big gap between college and pro. And there's a lot of guys, and in the time that I've been a free agent and tried to make teams and all that stuff, even before the USFL, there have been guys that I've seen that are phenomenal that don't make a roster, and there are guys that are not quite as good that do. And it's so bizarre to me that there's such a it's tough for these guys to be found sometimes. You know what I mean? And it's the same way from high school to college. I see these guys, like great example is like Cooper Kupp. He went to was it Montana State or Eastern Washington? He went to a not a Power Five school and absolutely dominated. And all of a sudden he gets drafted, and it was like, who's this guy? And now he's one of the few guys in the NFL that's just absolutely dominating on the receiving end. I think he's hurt this year, but overall, career wise,
Right.
and I think it's the same kind of idea. There are guys that either play at these high levels that you're behind an All American, or there's guys that play at an FCS or a D2 that for whatever reason they couldn't get into that higher level, then they get overlooked. And it's really, really tough because especially going from like arena to NFL, it doesn't happen all that much. So there has to be this level in between where you can scout players, you can see who's good, you can see like, hey, maybe they were on an NFL roster for 1 year and it didn't really work out, and they're a better fit at another team. They won't know unless they see those guys get their game film. So I think spring football overall it's really needed, and I'm incredibly thankful because without it, I probably would have retired a couple of years ago. Um, but yeah, I mean, it's a massive difference for the sport of football, and I think it keeps guys employed, and it's gonna really make a lot of guys' careers last a lot longer. Turpin is a great example over at Dallas. Brandon Aubrey, same thing. He was a soccer player. Without
Yeah.
the USFL, he would have never, ever, ever, ever played in the NFL, in my opinion. And he's gone out there and he's absolutely dominated. I was actually just talking about this yesterday with Sam Ficken, who is down in Carlsbad with us right now. We were talking about Brandon. He goes, dude, he is absolutely he shattered the record for most kicks made like to start a career. Um,
Yeah, I think
and
he's in the mid 20s now at least, like just a
it,
ridiculous number.
Yeah, it's absolutely insane, and he's absolutely earned it. Like it's tough because as an undrafted rookie, you're going to get a 3 year deal, so he has to now maintain that. But having said that, I think he's good enough too. It's just going to kind of depend on if he executes. Um, but it gave him the platform that he needed, and it's a prime example. And he's one, a really good dude, two, a really good soccer player and a great kicker. Three, he's deserved it and he's earned it. That's 100%.
No, I absolutely agree. And I think, especially for people that cover spring football have been watching it for so long. It's so refreshing to see these guys going to the NFL and proving that they can do it, right? Because it's kind of been the whole story all along. Is you see some people are like, these guys, they're washed up. That's why they're in spring football. A lot of these guys aren't washed up. It's just the fact that they haven't had an opportunity yet. There's only 53 spots on an NFL roster. Training camp, a lot of the time you can't get the proper reps you need to prove yourself to these coaches, to these staff. And again, a lot of things are situational. So to have these guys be able to get game film, it's so important. And I think that's why spring football has to last. It's a necessity. It's one of these days we're gonna have to see the NFL like actually partner with this league. I feel like that has to happen.
I feel like it has to, and I think it will. It's eventually it all comes down to money, and another piece of that too with the players not making the roster. Sometimes it comes down to money. Sometimes you're a guy that you're right behind a guy that got drafted, and they got to keep the guy that got drafted to save face, even if he's better. So sometimes there's just so many different scenarios that people don't think about. And but yeah, I agree. I think eventually there has to be some sort of an agreement between the two leagues, and maybe there is one coming. And obviously I don't know much, so maybe it's already happening. Who knows? But
Who knows?
yeah, I mean, with all the stuff that's been going on, I wouldn't be surprised. But it's tough. It's tough to make it into the league. I mean, just pure percentages, it's almost impossible. It's like 1% and 1% of kids that go from high
Right,
school all the way to the NFL that end up signing a contract and play, I think, more than like 2 games. It's a really, really small number.
right,
But yeah, it kills me sometimes. Like a great example, and this is more on the youth side. I have a kid who's a great punter, really, really good. He's just sitting behind a kid that's an All-American. I mean, this kid's got offers from USC and San Jose State and Air Force and all these great schools, and he's going to get more. And this kid doesn't have any game tape because he's behind an All-American. And I'm like, okay, he's a D1 caliber kid, and he just hasn't had that opportunity because he's behind somebody.
right.
So it's tough. It's very tough. And the same thing happens in college. Same thing happens in the pros. And you just have to be good and lucky at the same time to a certain extent.
Right. Yeah, again, it's a very situational, circumstantial type thing where sometimes you're just in the right place at the right time. Circle back a bit to your point too. It's like when it comes to the NFL, who knows if they may or may not partner with this league or if some other league comes up eventually and they partner with whatever happens. We've seen a lot of positivity from NFL executives the past couple of years with these spring leagues. Dallas is a great example. They signed Turpin, they signed Aubrey. But just throughout especially this past year when we had both leagues operating at around the same time, we saw guys in Washington, Pittsburgh, etc., where these coaches, these executives were like, yeah, we love what these spring leagues are doing. We hope they stick around because they're so fundamentally important to what we do. So you have to think the NFL is looking at this and it's like, this could be something we can invest in. And it also brings to my mind something that Daryl Johnston talked about kind of around the championship weekend, which was he'd love to work out some sort of thing where players can be sent down to these teams to be developed, right? You sign a guy that isn't going to get enough reps in training camp or is just going to sit on the practice squad. Why not send him to the USFL or the UFL or the XFL or whatever this league might be called and get him some reps so he can actually develop instead of sit on a practice squad and just wasting away?
Yeah, I totally agree. I totally agree. The hard part behind that, just to play devil's advocate, because I think you're right, and I think Daryl's right, is on the player side. Can you imagine playing football for 12 months out of the year and having zero downtime between playing in the
Right.
spring, going and playing games and practicing, and then going straight from there to an NFL training camp and having to go through the whole year? And it was a big deal last year at the Pro Bowl when they were talking to Turpin, and he was like, I think he had played like 32 games in a year or something. It was something
It
really
was insane.
absurd. Yeah, I mean, for guys to do that, obviously they won't be on the playing side, or maybe they will be, but that's a huge strain on the body. And if the pay is good enough, I'm all in. I'll do it. But you're spending time away from family, away from home, unless you live in that city, which very few times actually happens. And that was something that Sam and I talked about yesterday again too. Was he lives up in the Northeast, and he goes, okay, if I'm going to go play at X team, wherever it ends up being, and then I go to an NFL roster in the training camp in the other half of the country, I'm home for like a month out of the year. And, it's tough. It's very, very tough when you have a family, when you've got people you're trying to support, then you're trying to be there with them rather than just paying for them. Um, so it is tough. And I agree with you.
Yeah.
But there is one piece of that that is really, really hard to handle, which is just being away from home so often.
Right. Which I mean that's kind of something that I've talked to a lot of these players in these leagues is people don't realize the sacrifice that goes into playing football professionally. Like you said, the percentage is so small of guys that actually make it, that actually get those posts on social media from Bleacher Report or ESPN or whatever, like this player did so and so. It's very rare. Like almost nobody gets those. So I think that's why spring football is just so vital, just so important. So guys like yourself, guys like others can actually get those opportunities to prove themselves. But at moving forward here, 2024 season, lots of unknowns. Are there any goals you have set for yourself to just continue to keep getting better in this upcoming season?
Yeah, my goal is just no matter what, make every kick one kick at a time. I think when you look at it, some people kind of look a little too far down the road. I'm going to take it one step at a time. I'm going to enjoy being here, and wherever it takes me, I'm happy to go along. Whether it's the NFL, whether it's another year in the USFL, whether it's training camps or whatever. I don't want to say I'm just happy to be here. I am, but I I know in order to be successful, I can't look 30 steps down the road. I got to make sure I take one step at a time and make sure that I am really focused on what I'm doing and be where my feet are at. So yeah, that's my big thing. I more than anything, I want to be successful. I want us to win games. Um, and I think we can, and I think we will. It's just more than anything. It's making sure that I am doing everything I can to be present, be active, help us win games, and whatever happens after that that's out of my control is out of my control. And I'm just happy to be there and do everything I can when I get there.
I love the attitude, Cole. Well, I appreciate you joining me today on the USFL Podcast Player Interview Series. Got any parting words for us before we wrap things up here?
Uh, Whatever the league championship or whatever the league's name is, Michigan Panthers are going to win it 2024. Bet money on it.
All right. You heard it from the Cole Murphy himself. Michigan Panthers going to win whatever championship it might be. Cole, thank you so much for joining me. Appreciate you taking the time to come on the podcast today. Everybody, make sure you're checking out Cole Murphy on Instagram, on Twitter, wherever else. He's constantly sharing good information, whether you're a kicker, whether you're just a fan. Always good stuff going on over there. Cole, thanks again for joining us. And everybody have a great day, whoever watched.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.